Hello there, psych students. Professor Zeeb here. And what I'm going to teach you about this time is something called sampling. Sampling basically is this term we use in research to kind of refer to how we are selecting subjects to participate in our study. You may be wondering, what strategies do psychologists and scientists use to get people to be involved in the study? How do they pick people? How do they determine who they will study? That kind of thing. So that all revolves around this concept in research called sampling. And so we're going to talk about that and look at some different strategies of sampling subjects into studies. All right, so let's go to our slides here. So we're going to talk about something called sampling here. All right, so once again, just to repeat, sampling is referring to how we're actually getting or selecting subjects to participate in the study. Now, before we get to the different strategies, there's some terms that we're going to lay down to help you kind of understand the concepts involved here. So we're going to lay down the foundation with a couple different terms. So the first one we're going to talk about is something called the population. The population, specifically and technically, is the entire group of individuals that we are interested in studying. So for example, this could be everyone who lives in California. It could be every single person in the United States, or I mean, theoretically, it could be everyone on the planet. The point is that the population typically is a pretty large number, in some cases very large, and it represents the entire group of people that we are interested in studying and finding out about. So once again, we refer to that as the population. The problem with studying a population in a research study is that the numbers can be mind-boggling and just sort of inappropriate to study the sheer numbers. In other words, the numbers may be too great to feasibly study every single person in the population. So what psychologists do and scientists, rather than studying the entire population, they will draw out a sample of that population. So a sample technically is a small number of individuals that are supposedly representative of the population, and we will study just them to learn about the population. So it's a smaller number which is drawn from the population, okay? So I think visually it may kind of help you to understand this if we kind of go over to our whiteboard here. So I'm gonna switch it over, okay? And you see I've kind of pre-prepared it here, and I apologize for my really low budget graphics here, but bear with me. So let's imagine that our population that you see here on the screen represents 1,000 people. Let's say it's like a small city or small town, if you would, and it comprises of 1,000 people. For reasons that we said before, it may be difficult to study every single person in the population. We would have to contact all of those people. We would have to get them to agree to participate. It seems like that can be almost impossible, especially if your population is into the millions, and you can kind of see where we're going with that. So rather than study every single person in the population, we draw out a small number of people who are thought to represent the population. So this is our sample. And let's say that this represents 100 people. So rather than studying all 1,000, we draw out 100 names from that population and we study only these people. See, the point is that we're going to study the sample and then draw generalizations to the population, okay? So in other words, we're only going to study them, and we're going to gather our results and our findings and examine those, and then we're going to infer or assume that they apply to the population in whole. Now, remember, that can be problematic because the sample could be completely different than what the population is representing. And so that's another key point that we're going to talk about next. So let's switch it back over here to the slides here. Bear with me. All right, so when we're doing research, in most cases, we want to basically do what's called representative sampling. In other words, we want our sample to represent as closely as possible all of the key features that are seen in the population. So for example, let's say we've discovered that our population is 90% female and 10% male. So it's overwhelmingly female. It wouldn't make sense to have a sample that is 50-50, 50% males and 50% females, because it's not showing what's actually happening in the population. So we want our representative sample to as closely match those features of the population as possible. So we would be sure in our sample, if it was 100 people, and we said that 90% of the population is female, then roughly 90% of our subjects should be female, and then 10% would be male. So in other words, we would carefully consider all the different factors and variables in people that seem to be important in the study, and we would want to match those as closely as possible to the population, because that makes our findings, gives our findings more credence, more believable, because it's representing what's actually going on in the population. Remember, the goal is to understand what's happening in the population based on this sample. So representative sampling is a strategy we use to make sure that all those features closely represent what's happening in the population. That could be things like gender, biological sex, ethnic groups. It could be SES levels, socioeconomic status levels. It could be occupational factors. The point is that if we thought that any of those or all of those are important to influencing what we're studying and seem to be important, then we'd want to closely match those as much as possible, okay? One of the easiest ways to do this, and another strategy we could use with sampling, is something called a random sample. So you may have heard of this, like in the news or something. This researcher performed a random sample of the population. So what in the world does that mean? A random sample is just kind of what it sounds like. Basically, it's using the laws of probability to determine who our subjects are in the study. In other words, it's determining who we are going to select to participate in the study from the population. So technically, a random sample means that every single person in the population has an equal chance of being selected for the study. So the odds are exactly the same from person to person, okay? So if our population was 100, each person would have a 1% chance, basically, of being selected at any given time, okay? In other words, we're letting probability do the work for us to select our sample and to draw them out of the population. Why would we do that? Well, it helps to prevent bias. See, sometimes if as a researcher, I just pick whoever I want, I could come under fire because I may not be picking a true representative of the population. When we draw people out randomly, it tends to iron out differences in people and kind of gives an average finding or average person from that population. So one way we could do that is we could assign every single person in the population a number, and then we use computer programs to randomly spit out a list of 100 numbers, like a lottery kind of thing. And then those 100 people, those 100 numbers, which each represent a subject, are the ones that will participate in the study if everything plays out, okay? The point is that every single person in that population has an equal chance of being selected, and thus it's fair, and that helps to prevent bias and to help even out and iron out differences among people, if you follow me, okay? So that's one of our best strategies, is to take a random sample. It's not foolproof by any means. Sometimes you could get a biased sample by doing that, but in most cases, if you follow the kind of odds of probability, in most cases, you would get a pretty representative sample of the population. All right, another strategy we could use with sampling is called convenience sampling. And convenience sampling is just that. It is convenient for the researcher. In other words, what this basically means is that as the researcher, I can just basically pick and choose whoever I want to participate in the study. In other words, the group is chosen, the subjects are chosen because they can be easily studied. They're easily accessible. I can quickly gather a group of people. It's very convenient for me to do so. As an example, if I'm a college professor, I could just use my Psych 1 class that meets Tuesday, Thursdays at 10 o'clock. I have 50 people there at a certain time. It'd be very easy for me as a researcher to just use them in my study. The problem with that, even though it is very easy and very convenient, and I can quickly gather those folks to participate in the study, the problem is that they may not be representative of the population. Let's say my my population was everyone that attended the college that I teach at, if I just use my Psych 1 class Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 o'clock, that may not represent the typical student that goes to college, because we have night students, we have different ages, we have different days, and there may be reasons they're going to class at different times. So the only way we can really get away with this one is that if it really didn't matter who is in the sample, in other words, we're studying something that's sort of basic, you know, for example, basic visual processing in all humans, it wouldn't really matter who's in the study other than people with vision disabilities, obviously. But if we get around those kind of things, it really wouldn't matter who is in the sample, because we all kind of use those same strategies to, you know, to understand what vision is. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? So in other words, the variations that we see sometimes in samples may not matter in this type of sample, because we may be applying it to basic human processes, that kind of thing. So convenience sampling is very quick to do. It's very easy. It's very convenient, but it does have the risk of being a biased sample or not a representative sample, as we've already described. All right, the last one we're going to talk about is cross-cultural samples or cross-cultural sampling. Once again, very self-explanatory here. Let's say that we're studying a particular psychological disorder like bipolar or depression or something like that. And we want to know, are there cultural influences on that particular disorder? So what we would do here is we would sample different cultures, you know, maybe take a random sample from different cultures, you know, maybe 1,000 people from Spain, 1,000 people from Guatemala, 1,000 people from Australia, or wherever, you know, we're interested. And we would draw those samples out and study those samples and then cross-compare them to look for similarities and differences. We may find that a certain disorder is more prevalent in one population or culture compared to another. In fact, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual we use in psychology to diagnose people with disorders, includes this type of information. It does include cultural influences on disorders and things that we found through studies. And this is one of the ways they've discovered that, is by comparing cultural samples. So it's called cross-cultural sampling, where we're sampling from different cultures and then cross-comparing them to look for similarities or differences or whatever the case may be. Okay, so once again, just to kind of wrap it up here, guys, is that we use sampling to select students for, select subjects, excuse me, I'm a teacher, I'm used to saying that, select participants or subjects to take part in the study. And there's different strategies, as you can see, that have pros and cons, okay? So you want to kind of think about this. This is one of the ways that we do that, or some of the different strategies that we employ, all right? All right, so what I want you to do is just go ahead and go on to the next step in the class, and we will see you online.